Tonight's story is about a football match. But really, it's about something a little bigger than that. It's about two countries, an ocean apart, who have spent more than 60 years bumping into each other on the same green rectangle of grass. And somehow, every single time, walking away with a story worth telling. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Let your breath slow down, in through the nose and out, long and easy. You don't need to know anything about football to enjoy this. You just need to let the pictures form quietly in your mind, one after another, like old photographs being turned over in low light. Because tonight, we're going back through decades of packed stadiums and grainy television footage, back to a hand that touched a ball in Mexico City, to a boy who became a villain and then a hero in the space of 4 years, to a captain who once sat down on a red carpet meant for a queen. It's a long story, so there's no need to hold on to every detail. Just let it wash over you, the way a tide comes in without asking permission. We'll begin gently, with a little bit of history, just enough to understand why this particular rivalry carries so much weight, more weight, really, than almost any other in the sport. And then we'll drift through 4 matches, 4 different decades, 4 sets of players, who each added their own chapter. By the end, you might not remember every name. That's fine. Some stories are less about memorizing and more about the feeling they leave behind. So get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Dim whatever light is still on. And let's begin. Football, as a global game, took its modern shape in England, in the muddy fields and industrial towns of the 19th century, and from there it spread outward, carried by sailors and merchants and expatriates, until it landed in South America, where a very different culture took hold of it. In Argentina, the game arrived through British railway workers and businessmen in Buenos Aires, and within a generation, it had become something entirely its own, flowing, improvisational, full of flair, closer in spirit to dance than to the more direct, physical style that had developed back in England. By the middle of the 20th century, both countries had built proud footballing traditions, but they existed mostly at a distance from one another, admiring or dismissing each other from across an ocean. It wasn't until the World Cup began drawing nations together on a single rotating stage that England and Argentina would actually meet with any regularity. And when they did meet, something interesting happened almost every time. Not simple defeats or simple victories, but incidents, controversies, moments that outlived the final whistle by decades. Part of this has to do with style. English football, for much of its history, prized directness, physicality, a certain no-nonsense toughness, the kind of game played in the rain on heavy pitches, where the shortest route to goal was usually the best one. Argentine football, shaped by different fields and a different temperament, prized cleverness, dribbling, a kind of theatrical cunning that could tip, depending on your perspective, into either genius or gamesmanship. Fans in Buenos Aires grew up admiring players who could make a defender look foolish with a single touch, while fans in England grew up admiring players who could win a physical battle in a crowded penalty box. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply different answers to the same question. And when these two philosophies collided on the pitch, the resulting friction produced everything from legendary goals to genuine ill will. But there is another layer to this rivalry, one that sits quietly underneath the football and rarely goes away entirely. In 1982, Britain and Argentina fought a brief but bitter war over a small group of islands in the South Atlantic, known in English as the Falkland Islands and in Spanish as the Islas Malvinas. It lasted only a few months, but it left a lasting imprint on both nations, and it meant that any football match between England and Argentina that followed would carry, whether anyone wanted it to or not, an echo of that conflict. Players from both sides have said, across the years, that this political backdrop was rarely spoken about directly in the dressing room, and yet it was somehow always present, felt more than discussed, like weather pressing against a window. Understanding this helps explain why, of all football's rivalries, this one produces such extraordinary emotional intensity. It isn't simply England versus Argentina. It's one style of football meeting another, one set of instincts meeting a very different set, and underneath it all, a shared and complicated history that neither team ever fully leaves at home, no matter how many years pass between meetings. Commentators, journalists, and the players themselves have often noted that this particular fixture seems to carry more weight than almost any other rivalry in the sport, more even than fixtures between neighboring countries who share a border and a long list of ordinary grievances. Perhaps it's the distance itself that does it. Two footballing cultures, an ocean apart, who only rarely get the chance to settle anything. And so every meeting arrives already carrying the residue of everything that came before it. With all of that quietly in place, let's travel back to where the story really begins, to a cold afternoon in London in the summer of 1966. England were hosting the World Cup that year, and expectations at home were enormous. The national team had never won the tournament before, and there was a sense, shared by players and public alike, that this might finally be their moment. Argentina arrived as a dangerous, technically gifted side, captained by a tough, uncompromising defender named Antonio Ratin. The two teams had already met once before, in a group match in Chile 4 years earlier. A fairly uneventful affair that England won comfortably. Nobody could have guessed what would happen when they met again, this time in a quarter-final at Wembley Stadium. The match itself was tense and physical from the start, refereed by a German official named Rudolf Kreitlein, a man who, by most accounts, struggled to communicate clearly with players who spoke neither English nor German. Midway through the first half, Kreitlein booked Ratin for a foul, and then booked him again a short time later. Under the rules, 2 cautions should have meant an ejection from the match. But at that point in football history, there were no coloured cards to make such decisions visible and unambiguous. There was only the referee's word, and considerable confusion about what exactly had just happened. Ratin, believing the decision unjust and unable to get clarity through an interpreter, refused to leave the field. What followed was one of the strangest episodes in World Cup history. A 10-minute standoff in which the Argentine captain simply would not go, arguing his case to a referee who could not understand him, while nearly 100,000 spectators inside Wembley waited, murmured, and grew increasingly restless. When Ratin finally did leave the pitch, escorted by police officers, he paused along the touchline and sat down, briefly, on a red carpet that had been laid out for a planned appearance by Queen Elizabeth II. It was a small, almost theatrical gesture of protest, and it became one of the enduring images of the entire tournament. England went on to win the match 1-0, courtesy of a goal from Geoff Hurst that Argentina felt, to this day, should have been ruled offside. In the aftermath, England's manager Alf Ramsey gave interviews in which he described the Argentine players as behaving, in his words, like animals. A remark that caused lasting offence in Argentina, and that even some of his own players later felt was too harsh a word, even if the game itself had genuinely been an ill-tempered one. Ramsey was so upset by what he perceived as Argentina's conduct that he refused to allow his players to take part in the traditional post-match custom of swapping shirts with their opponents. A small gesture of sportsmanship that is common after international matches. The episode had lasting consequences far beyond the 2 countries involved. FIFA, football's governing body, recognized that a referee alone, without any visible signal, had no reliable way to communicate a caution or an ejection to players, spectators, and broadcasters who might not share a language. Out of this exact confusion came an idea that would change football forever. Coloured cards. Yellow for a caution, red for a dismissal, a wordless signal that anyone, anywhere, could instantly understand. It's a strange thought, if you sit with it a moment, that something as small and universal as a referee reaching into his pocket for a red card traces its origin back to one stubborn, confused afternoon at Wembley in 1966. Argentina's players, for their part, always felt they had been wronged that day, believing the referee favoured the home nation at nearly every turn. It was a wound that didn't heal quickly, and it set the tone for a rivalry that would, 20 years later, produce its single most famous, most argued-over moment of all. Let's move forward now, past the 1970s, past the Falklands conflict of 1982, and into the summer of 1986, to a stadium in Mexico City called the Azteca, on an afternoon in late June. By this point, Diego Maradona had established himself as the finest footballer on the planet. A short, powerfully built playmaker with a low centre of gravity and an almost impossible level of close control. he captained Argentina into a quarter-final against England, a match that, given everything that had passed between the two nations, both on the pitch and off it, carried an unmistakable emotional charge before a ball was even kicked. Years later, Argentine defender Oscar Ruggeri would recall that Maradona addressed the squad before kickoff, reminding his teammates, gently but unmistakably, of the losses their country had suffered in the recent conflict with Britain. It wasn't something the players needed spelled out. It simply hung in the air. In the 51st minute, with the score still level, Maradona rose to meet a high looping ball inside the England penalty area, alongside goalkeeper Peter Shilton, who had every physical advantage in height and reach. Instead of heading the ball, Maradona reached up with his left hand and guided it into the net. It happened so quickly and so smoothly that the Tunisian referee, Ali bin Nasser, allowed the goal to stand, apparently unable to see the handball from his angle, and Maradona wheeled away to celebrate as though nothing were amiss, even as English players surrounded the referee in protest. 4 minutes later, as if to underline his genius rather than apologize for it, Maradona scored again. This time, a goal built entirely from his own dazzling skill, weaving through half the England team from inside his own half before slotting the ball past Shilton. It is often ranked among the greatest individual goals in World Cup history, and it sits strangely right beside the most disputed one, in the very same match, scored by the very same man. Afterward, asked to explain the first goal, Maradona offered a phrase that has followed him ever since, describing the goal as coming a little from his own head, and a little from what he called the hand of God. It became one of football's most famous quotes, and like most famous quotes, it carries more than one meaning depending on who is listening. To English ears, it sounded almost like a taunt, an admission of cheating dressed up in poetic language. To Maradona, and to many in Argentina, it carried something closer to a sense of symbolic justice. A small and unlikely victory snatched from a much more powerful opponent, arriving not long after a war their country had lost. Peter Shilton has said, in the years since, that what troubles him most isn't really the goal itself, but the fact that Maradona never once acknowledged, in any straightforward way, that he had used his hand deliberately. English defender Terry Butcher has said much the same, that it is hard, even decades later, to fully let go of the disappointment of losing a World Cup quarter-final in such circumstances. Maradona, for his part, maintained for years that it had all happened too quickly for the officials to notice, though he did eventually, in a documentary interview near the end of his life, admit plainly that he had known exactly what his hand was doing in that moment. He described it, one more time, as a kind of quiet, satisfying revenge. Maradona passed away in 2020, but that single afternoon in Mexico City has outlived him by many years already, and will likely outlive everyone currently watching this video too. Let's slow down for a moment here and take a breath together. there's no need to rush through the rest. We still have 2 more chapters of this story to visit, but there's plenty of night left ahead of us. The next meeting worth lingering on took place 12 years later, in the summer of 1998, in a French town called Saint-Étienne, during a round of 16 match at that year's World Cup. By now, a new generation of players had emerged, and one of them, a young English midfielder named David Beckham, was beginning to establish himself as one of the most talented and most closely watched players of his era. Midway through the match, Beckham found himself tangled on the ground with Argentina's Diego Simeone, a combative and streetwise midfielder. Simeone placed a hand on the back of Beckham's head, and Beckham, reacting instinctively and without much thought, kicked out at him from the ground. It was a minor, almost petulant gesture, the kind of thing that happens in the heat of a match, and is usually forgotten within minutes. But Simeone, sensing an opportunity, reacted as though he had been struck far harder than he actually had, and the referee, taking the bait, sent Beckham off. England were forced to play the remaining hour of the match with only 10 players, eventually losing on penalties after a 2-2 draw. Beckham, still only 23 years old, returned home to find himself cast, almost overnight, as the villain of the entire tournament, splashed across newspaper front pages with cruel and dismissive headlines. It was, by his own later admission, one of the most difficult periods of his career. A stretch of months in which he became something close to a national scapegoat for a defeat that, in truth, involved 11 players and 90 long minutes, not one moment from one young man. Simeone himself would later admit, candidly, that he had exaggerated the contact in order to get Beckham dismissed, adding that most players in his position probably would have done the same thing. It's an admission that says quite a lot about the kind of gamesmanship that has always simmered beneath this particular fixture. Not simply talent against talent, but nerve against nerve, cunning against innocence. English players who were there that day have spoken since about how differently the two sides seemed to experience the occasion. Where England players carried the memory of Maradona's handball as a football grievance, several Argentine players carried something that felt, to them, larger and more historical, tied to the wider relationship between the two countries. Some England players later admitted that watching the Argentine team celebrate afterward, shirts off, singing on the team bus, stung in a way that lingered for years, feeding directly into what would happen the very next time the two nations met. Which brings us gently to the year 2002, and a World Cup held that summer in Japan and South Korea. England and Argentina were drawn together once again, this time in the group stage in the city of Sapporo. For David Beckham, now the captain of his country, it was an opportunity he had quietly been waiting 4 long years for. The match remained scoreless until just before half-time, when England forward Michael Owen went down inside the Argentine penalty area under a challenge from defender Mauricio Pochettino. who would, many years later, go on to manage the United States men's national team. It was, by most honest accounts on both sides, a borderline decision, the kind of moment that could have gone either way, depending entirely on the angle from which you watched it. The referee pointed to the penalty spot. Pochettino himself later admitted he had been somewhat careless in allowing the contact to happen at all, even while insisting good-naturedly and for years afterward that he never actually touched Owen. Beckham stepped up to take the penalty himself. It was, in many ways, the perfect and almost poetic setting for the redemption he had been waiting for since that difficult night in Saint-Étienne. He struck the ball firmly down the middle, past goalkeeper Pablo Caballero, and as it hit the net, something in English football seemed to exhale all at once. Beckham has said that in that instant he understood exactly what the goal meant, not just for the match, but for how the country would finally see him again. England held on to win 1-0, and Beckham, for so long cast as the nation's villain, walked off that pitch as something closer to a hero, forgiven in the eyes of a public who had once turned so sharply against him. It is worth pausing on that for a moment before we drift onward. A single penalty kick, taken calmly under enormous pressure, quietly closing a chapter that had opened 4 years earlier in an entirely different country, against, of all possible opponents, the very same rival. Football has a way of offering these strange, almost novelistic symmetries, and this rivalry, more than most, seems to produce them again and again. There have been other meetings since then, quieter ones, friendlies mostly, without quite the same stakes or the same fireworks, and for a long stretch of years, the two sides simply didn't cross paths at all on football's biggest stage, which is part of what makes any new meeting between them feel, even now, like the resumption of something much older than either current squad, something the players themselves inherit rather than create. As it happens, this story arrives at a moment when that history feels close enough to touch. England and Argentina are meeting again on football's largest stage for the first time in years, each side carrying, in some quiet way, the accumulated weight of Wembley in 1966, the Azteca in 1986, Saint-Étienne in 1998, and Sapporo in 2002. Antonio Rattan, whose 10-minute standoff at Wembley changed the rules of the sport itself, passed away only recently, at the age of 89, which lends this particular chapter a gentle, reflective quality, a reminder that even the fiercest rivalries are, in the end, made up of ordinary people growing older and eventually leaving the story to others. There's something worth sitting with here at the end about what a rivalry like this really tells us. It isn't really about who was right in 1966, or whether a hand should have been called in 1986, or whether a kick in 1998 deserved quite the punishment it received. Those arguments will likely never be fully settled, and perhaps that's exactly the point. What the rivalry actually reveals is something quieter, and more human. How a single afternoon can follow a person for the rest of their life. How a country's grief and pride can attach themselves, almost without anyone choosing it, to a game played by 22 people and a ball, and how forgiveness, when it eventually comes, as it did for Beckham, can feel as significant as any goal. 6 decades is a long time. Long enough for players to become managers, for villains to become heroes, and then simply become themselves again, for old grievances to soften at the edges even while never quite disappearing. Long enough, too, for a stubborn 10-minute standoff on a red carpet to quietly reshape how referees speak to players in every match, played anywhere in the world, in a language that needs no translation at all. Somewhere tonight, in stadiums and living rooms and quiet bedrooms like yours, people are thinking about this rivalry again, adding one more small chapter to a story that has already outlasted most of the people who started it. But you don't need to carry any of that with you now. The whistle has blown, the stadium lights are dimming, and the crowd is slowly making its way out into the cool night air, their voices fading into the distance. Let the story rest here, unfinished the way all good rivalries stay unfinished, always waiting quietly for the next chapter, whenever that may come. For now, there's nothing left to watch, nothing left to argue about, nothing left to do at all, except let your eyes close and drift slowly into sleep.